So our final talk of the day is going to be from Jonathan Storkey from Rothamsted Research, who's going to give us a roundup and a summary on IPM, specifically related to weeds. So John has now been at Rothamsted for 25 years. He started life in Peter Lutman's weed ecology group with an emphasis on modelling weed competition, and he now leads several large collaborative projects that seek to apply integrated and nature-based solutions to achieve sustainable crop production and protection. John trained in both agronomy and ecology, and he seeks to apply ecological thinking to managing weed communities, and he leads the Rothamsted Institute Strategic Programme Assist in partnership with the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. Thanks, John. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Nicola. Hopefully you can all see my PowerPoint. So I've been asked to provide a wrap-up at the end of the day and summarise some of the general themes that have emerged from the talks. I realise we're probably all a bit Zoom weary by now, so I won't speak for long and hopefully leave plenty of time for a more general discussion at the end. But I've tried to think about what we've heard today, which I'm sure you'll agree has all been really encouraging in terms of the positive approach and attitudes towards making weed management more sustainable. I've tried to summarise it in terms of a roadmap and where we are in terms of the progress we're making and where we need to get to. And my first bullet is that we all need to be travelling in the same direction. And I think from the talks today, that's clear that we are. Adrian introduced the strong policy drivers that we're all responding to that are forcing us to think about alternatives to herbicides and ways of reducing the impact of herbicides. And both Joe and Pete in the horticultural sector highlighted the challenge of reducing active ingredients and the challenge of finding effective control measures in horticulture. Sean actually made the really interesting point that everyone's on this road already, whether they know or like it or not. And also, again, spoke about some of the limitations of herbicides while acknowledging that they're going to be an important tool in the strategies going forward. So under each of these bullet points, I've just added a personal perspective and question that might guide our discussion later. And there seems to be a need to more clearly define IPM or IWM in terms that are accessible to as many people as possible without overcomplicating it. And there's an issue around how we incentivize the uptake of IPM for those who are resistant, perhaps that group of people in Henry's slides, the low uptake group. So how do we provide clarity of vision and get people moving as a community? My second point is that we're all kind of making progress. We're still finding our way, and we need new maps, or we need effective sources of advice and information. And a number of speakers, including Henry, Hannah, Barney and Sean, all highlighted that. Effectively, what we're talking about is replacing input intensive systems with knowledge intensive systems. And so we need to provide effective avenues for people to find that knowledge. And then Sarah and Sophie warned of some of the potential trade-offs or pitfalls along the way, whereby we're focusing just on one target, on weeds, we might incur some unintended consequences on other outcomes, for example, soil health or carbon emissions. So all of this highlights the need to develop those effective links between research and practice, which I think we are getting a lot better at. Several speakers highlighted the need for attention to detail at the field level and the need to monitor the situation at that scale. And then again, there was the need for a simple metric for quantifying progress, how well we're doing, and comparing and benchmarking farms. And it was encouraging to hear about the benchmarking scheme from Groundswell. So a couple of questions from me on that. How do we measure progress? How do we benchmark progress in terms of how well are we doing in IWM or more broadly IPM? And then are there false summits? And by that, I mean, are there situations where people might feel that they've arrived or they're doing enough by, for example, growing more spring crops or rotating active ingredients, whereas in fact they need to do more to make the situation sustainable? And then are there dead ends? And by that, I mean perhaps trade-offs with other outcomes that we'll need to deliver around soil carbon or biodiversity. And so we need to understand those and be aware of those in plotting our course. And the final point is that our starting point, there's an old joke about somebody who asked for directions and the person said, well, if I was going there, I wouldn't start from where you are. And there's an element of that in integrated weed management. Blackgrass has been mentioned a lot, and it always is in these meetings. Some years, all of the talks are about blackgrass. And oftentimes, IWM seems to be integrated blackgrass control. Whereas what we should really be thinking about is the whole weed community and the whole system. So we're oftentimes reacting to a problem, which is blackgrass in winter cereals, which is okay up to a point. But it might be that we hit the limits of what we can do within our existing rotations and systems. And I think there were a couple of examples of that today from Sean's experience of the poor spring seedbeds, which were a limitation in 2019. And Hannah started her talk with a really interesting picture of a blackgrass infestation in a wheat field that had been spring cropped for the previous 4 years. And again, I think that highlights the limitations of using one or two IWM interventions when actually there might need to be a more fundamental change in the system. And again, that was very well illustrated by Barney and Hannah's talks. So my question is there enough emphasis on prevention rather than on control and reacting to a problem once we have it? And should we be focusing on managing communities or regulating weed communities rather than controlling species? And again, we've heard a couple of interesting examples of the perennial weeds and the bromes possibly becoming more of a problem in reduced tillage systems. So my final thought is just to introduce you to a diagram that somebody in my group, a postdoc in my group, Chloe McLaren and Helen Metcalf is also on this talk, was involved in this paper, came up with, and they gave a lot of thought into kind of the philosophical approach to integrated weed management and sustainable weed management. And you can have a look at this paper if you would like, or I can send you a PDF if you ask for it. And basically, Chloe was thinking about two overarching paradigms or philosophies in our approach to weed management. And the one on the left really characterizes the past 20, 30 years where we've become very reliant on herbicide solutions. Sean mentioned the fact that we've been spoilt by the number of products and succession of products that we've been supplied with. And only now are we beginning to have to learn to live without them. So on that left-hand side, the herbicide can is really the first thing we reach for when there's a problem. And we become reliant on what Chloe called these techno fixes, really not worrying too much about the ecology and what's going on elsewhere in the system. And then IWM has been built on that or we've adapted as the herbicides have reduced in their efficacy. But Chloe's argument in the paper, and I would agree with it, is that whole approach is unsustainable because it pushes us down a route where we rely on too few control tools and we end up designing unstable systems that are very vulnerable to weeds becoming a problem. And the contrast to that is starting really where Barney and Hannah were starting in thinking about going back to the drawing board and thinking about how do I make my cropping system resilient to weeds in the first place, and how do I build a healthy functioning system that meets several outcomes, of which one is a sustainable weed management approach. So it's building that ecological foundation, and integrated weed management is a really important part of that, but it's working in synergy and in harmony with those ecosystem processes rather than against them. And the argument is that that system, although you might have short-term trade-offs and reductions in productivity, in the long term, you'll have a reduced vulnerability to weeds and a lower reliance on any particular control tool. So I guess my parting question for you with that diagram is to think about what is our direction of travel, and whether integrated weed management is the destination, or it's a waypoint to a more sustainable system. And with that, Nikki, I'll stop.
That's great. Thank you, John. That's a really good roundup.